we're back. We have Trevor Loudon's Enemies Within. We've read the prologue, and now we have Chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Enemies Within. Communism's Big Secret. The international communist movement holds many secrets, one being that it still exists and in many ways is more powerful than ever before. However, the biggest secret of communism has to do with its methodology and its means of achieving its goals. While countless books have been written on atom bomb spies, charismatic revolutionaries, some of whom wore hats that were shaped like this, Kremlinology, and the huge death toll of 20th century communism, very few commentators have touched on the greatest impact communism has had on Western society. The big secret of communism is the method by which tiny local communist parties, often acting under the direction of foreign powers, are able to get their policies adopted as the, quote, law of the land, end quote, in their own country. How far-fetched is that? How credible is it that a tiny communist party, maybe only a few hundred comrades strong, could influence public policy in a country with tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of voters? Where's the evidence for such a seemingly implausible claim? Firstly, I will outline the process and then give examples of the process in action, one from my country, New Zealand, and 4 from the United States. The process. The goal of the world communist movement was always to first socialize the entire planet under centralized government control, then to move to a classless worker-controlled society. The second part will never happen, but the centralized control aspect is making steady progress. After the initial burst of European revolutions all failed in the 1920s, the communist movement began a long-term plan to move individual countries to socialism by force where possible, by filtration and manipulation when not. After Eastern Europe and China were communized by force after World War II, communist expansionism was resisted by stiff Western resolve. The Cold War was essentially a stalemate. Communism could only expand peripherally, mainly in the poorer countries of Africa and Asia. Force was too risky to apply to the main targets of Western Europe and North America. Infiltration and manipulation would have to be amped up. Western Europe, Canada, and the United States would have to be socialized from the inside out. The existing order would have to be overturned by a process of subversion. Education, the churches, and the media were all targeted. But the key focus, something hardly touched on by scholars, was the systematic infiltration and manipulation of the legislative bodies of each major Western nation. The communists rightly surmised that if they could influence or manipulate the British Parliament, the German Bundestag, and the U.S. Congress, what did it matter how many missiles NATO possessed or how many troops they could mass on the Rhine? Step 1. Policy formation. During the, quote, Cold War, end quote, policy was established in Moscow by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union leadership in conjunction with the International Department and the KGB. The question was asked by the leadership, what domestic or foreign policy do we want France, or Canada, or Italy, or New Zealand, or the United States to adopt to move that country more towards socialism or to tilt the balance of power more in our favor? Since the more apparent than real collapse of communism in the 1990s, more apparent than real, I agree with that. My note. Communist international policy formation appears to have been more decentralized. All the major international communist fronts created by Soviets in the 1940s and 50s, the World Peace Council, World Federation of Trade Unions, Women's International Democratic Federation, World Federation of Democratic Youth, and International Association of Democratic Lawyers, are still actively working as a team, promoting the communist line whenever they can. Today they are controlled more by Cuban, Greek, and Third World communists, but follow policies almost identical to those of their former Soviet masters. Currently, most major Western communist parties, including the Communist Party USA, tend to look more to China for leadership, though Russian and former Eastern Bloc communists are still a major part of the international movement. Step 2. Indoctrination. In Soviet times, thousands of foreign communists were trained every year in many Eastern Bloc academies, particularly Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning, aka Institute of Social Sciences, and the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. The main purpose of the institutes was to indoctrinate foreign communists into following Moscow's line. A major part of the training was to learn how to use their own country's labor movement, peace movement, churches and civil organizations to influence policy formation in their native country's, quote, mainstream, end quote, left-wing political party. The British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party, the German Social Democrats, the Canadian Liberals, or the United States Democratic Party. Interestingly, during the 1980s, no American communists were allowed to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. It was considered way too dangerous and provocative. Instead, the Soviets would indoctrinate Canadians or even New Zealanders in the appropriate, quote, line, end quote. Then those cadres would be sent to train the American communists. Today, this process is more decentralized, with more indoctrination being done in-country or through the major international front organizations. Socialists, such as the United States Democratic Socialists of America, get much of their direction from the Socialist International. That body is now so thoroughly compromised by admitting former communist parties and even bona fide terrorist groups such as Fatah that its, quote, line, end quote, is almost identical to that of the openly communist movement. Step 3. Implementation. As Lenin said of trade unions, they are the, quote, transmission belts from the Communist Party to the masses, end quote. Communist control of the labor movement is the key to the implementation phase of communist policy infiltration into Western countries. Every major communist party does its level best to take over the local labor movement. There are several reasons for this, but the most important and overlooked one is this. Every mainstream left-wing party in the Western democracies is dominated by the labor movement. The unions fund these parties, contribute manpower at election time, and block vote at their conferences. Labor unions effectively dominate every major left-wing political party in every major and most minor Western countries. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Labor unions, by providing the money and muscle, can dictate party policy, and they can usually have a big say in candidate selection. The process is clear. The international communist movement or the local communist party sets a desired policy, whether it's strengthening labor legislation, state funding of political parties, a more socialist school curriculum, a more liberal immigration policies, canceling a new weapons system, relaxing trade sanctions on Cuba, whatever is paramount on the communist agenda at that time. The communists and their socialist allies then make these communist policies union policies. The unions then put pressure on the local Labour Party, Socialist Party, or Democratic Party to adopt these union policies as their own. As labor effectively controls these major parties, the process is often not that difficult. So, communist policies become union policies, which in turn become, quote, mainstream, end quote, political party policies. What the Communist Party wants today, the Labour Party will implement tomorrow. And the vast bulk of the voting public will have no idea that the policies they are voting for originated in Moscow, Havana, Beijing, or in local Communist Party headquarters. This process has been carried out countless times all over the world. It was much more difficult in the United States for many years because the U.S. labor movement was uniquely led by militant anti-communists like George Meany and Lane Kirkland. However, the left took over the U.S. labor movement in 1995 and installed Democratic Socialists of America member John Sweeney as president of the AFL-CIO. The next step was to remove the clause from the AFL-CIO Constitution banning communists from holding office in AFL-CIO affiliated unions. The communists and socialists came flooding back and now dominate every major union in the United States. That is why the move to United States socialism has gone into overdrive since the Democrats took power in 2008. They are following a union agenda foisted upon them by the Communist Party USA and Democratic Socialists of America. If you want to know what the Democrats will do tomorrow, read the Communist Party People's World or the Democratic Socialist Left. Democratic Socialist, Democratic Left today. Example 1. How the Soviets destroyed a U.S. military alliance. For several decades, my country, New Zealand, was a staunchly pro-American member of the Australia-New Zealand-United States military alliance, ANZUS, A-N-Z-U-S. Older Kiwis, in particular, were very pro-American. Memories of World War II still lingered. Many remembered the very real fear of a Japanese invasion and the huge sacrifice of American lives that kept us free. Right up until the early 1980s, it was inconceivable that New Zealand would ever turn its back on our military alliance with the United States. Stunningly, ANZUS was effectively dead in the water by 1984, when New Zealand's newly elected socialist Labour government banned nuclear warships from the country's harbors. It has not been properly revived to this day. Nearly 3 years later, a nuclear-free zone disarmament and arms control bill passed into law on June 4, 1987. The event has assumed a heroic mythology in New Zealand. Kiwis dared to stand up to the United States and forge its own independent foreign policy. Most New Zealanders still regard that legislation as one of our country's greatest achievements. So powerful is the myth that in early 2007, John Key, the new leader of the Conservative National Party, made it clear that his party would adhere to the status quo on any potential visit by nuclear-powered warships. He recognized domestic, political, and cultural realities. The New Zealand peace movement. The New Zealand anti-nuclear movement didn't arrive from nowhere. It was more than 20 years in the making. The early 1980s, though, saw a mushrooming of anti-nuke activism. By late 1986, the New Zealand peace movement consisted of over 350 disparate groups, this in a population of under 4 million. 1,000, or 1/5, of Kiwi physicians belonged to the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Town councils voted to become nuclear-free, erecting notices at their boundaries that one was entering a nuclear-free zone. By 1987, 70% of New Zealand's population was living in such zones. New Zealand was heralded as a shining example to the world. Its homegrown peace movement had triumphed and is still giving most New Zealanders a sense of pride in their non-aligned status. They had created their own destiny. Quote, correlation of forces, end quote. However, even today, only very few New Zealanders realize that the anti-nuclear movement served the strategic interests of the Soviet Union. New Zealand was specifically targeted in a clandestine political operation designed to remove it from the Western Alliance. In the late 1970s, policymakers in the International Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union developed doctrine concerning exploiting what they termed the, quote, correlation of forces, end quote, within a particular country to achieve a specific outcome. This implied expert direction of the correlation, influencing the unions. The key force to be correlated, quotes, was the New Zealand trade union movement. It would be helpful at this point to outline the changes that were occurring. Tony Neary, now deceased, the conservative leader of the Electrical Workers Union, chronicled the infiltration in a paper he gave at a conference in Washington, D.C. in March of 1987 under the auspices of the Hoover Institute. Neary claimed that the Soviet Union, through one of its main front organizations, the World Federation of Trade Unions, had successfully infiltrated the New Zealand trade union movement and changed its direction. He noted that until the mid-1970s there was a good working relationship between the NZ Federation of Labor, FOL, and the United States Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO. The change began in May 1979 when Jim Knox was elected New Zealand FOL president, and regular visits by NZ trade unionists to the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries commenced. By 1986, known communists from the Moscow-aligned Socialist Unity Party SUP, and the Maoist-leaning Workers' Communist League, along with their sympathizers, had considerable control in 7 of the 8 largest trade councils, covering 70% of the FOL membership. Bill Anderson, president of the SUP and the Auckland Trades Council, attended the 27th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March of 1986. Joint communique signed by Jim Knox on behalf of the FOL and by the heads of visiting Soviet delegations had been adopted by delegates at the 1984 and 1985 FOL conferences. Behind Jim Knox was Ken Douglas, the powerful General Secretary of the FOL and Chairman of the SUP. In 1986, it took 2 months worth of, quote, he took, Ken Douglas, 2 months worth of, quote, sick leave, end quote, to visit the Soviet Union. That year, Jim Knox also visited the Soviet Union, where, according to the Soviet news agency TASS, T-A-S-S, on February 22nd, he pledged to, quote, pool efforts in the struggle to prevent a new war with which the imperialist states, above all the United States administration, threaten mankind, end quote. He also said, quote, Soviet peace initiatives are highly appreciated in New Zealand and are supported by broad sections of the population, end quote. TASS, in February of 1985, quoted Knox as saying that, quote, contacts between the trade unions of New Zealand and the USSR grow stronger from year to year. New Zealand trade unionists follow with interest the Soviet people's strides and come to see for themselves that the socialist system acts in the interests of the working people, end quote. A vignette from that era illustrates the relationship. Each year, the Soviet embassy in Wellington invited delegates from the FOL conference to an embassy function. During the 1986 conference, most delegates attended this reception. To emphasize the importance of the NZ-USSR relationship at the conference, Jim Knox warmly presented the Soviet delegates with large, expensive sheepskin rugs. The American guests from the AFL-CIO received a small brown paper parcel. From the rostrum, Knox told delegates that the parcel contained a book on New Zealand, but when the American visitor opened the paper, he found a small cheese board. The New Zealand Herald reported that it was a case of hard cheese for the American delegate. Tony Neary had considerable public respect for the lonely struggle he undertook, but his criticisms of Soviet trade unions as mere appendages of the state were rejected within the FOL. He was regularly accused of seeing, quote, reds under the bed, end quote, to which he responded, in the New Zealand trade union movement, those who matter about reds under the beds must be joking. The reds are already in the beds and have been there for some years. By now they are sitting up and getting breakfast brought in. KGB interest. Oleg Gordievsky, a former high-ranking officer of the Soviet Security Service, the KGB, who from 1974 worked as a long-serving undercover agent for the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, until his former defection in 1985 recalled. KGB in Australasia was increased as a result of the election of David Laing's Labour government in New Zealand on an anti-nuclear program in 1984. The KGB Centre was jubilant at Laing's election. Gordievsky visited New Zealand on 4 occasions from 1986 onwards to brief that country's Security Intelligence Service on Soviet clandestine activities within the region. For years, he said, New Zealand, quote, had been under massive propaganda and ideological attack from the KGB and the Soviet Central Committee, and the ruling Labour Party had seemed unaware of the extent to which the fabric of their society was being damaged by subversion. In its attempts to draw New Zealand into nuclear-free activities, the Soviet authorities had made tremendous efforts to penetrate and strengthen the Labour Party, partly through the local party of Socialist Unity, in effect the Communist Party of New Zealand, and partly through the Trades Union Congress. Gordievsky alleged that the New Zealand and Australian communists were being run by the International Department of the CPSU. He said, I know the situation in New Zealand very well. Only 500 members of the Socialist Party, Unity Party, but they are invaluable because each was ready to do something. It was like the KGB had 500 agents in the country. He added, quote, plus some of them penetrated the trade unions and then they penetrated the left wing of the NZ Labour Party, end quote. The peace push. Their aspirations were spelt out in the Socialist Unity Party Auckland Region regional newsletter dated November 12, 1980. To date, in the region, the Peace Council has made good progress among trade unions, but more effort must be made to build on this and take the peace question to the factory floor. Also needed now is to broaden the Peace Council into other areas of the community, to join up prominent personalities including MPs, increase church involvement, university involvement, other peace groups, community clubs, etc. Here branches and comrades can act as catalysts. We must be extremely careful that in building the Peace Council it does not become overburdened with SUP people, or be labeled as just another, quote, SUP, end quote, front. If our party is working correctly, only a few comrades reporting back to the region or branches and taking forward issues from the same sources are necessary to ensure effective involvement in the peace movement. The broadest possible base is needed if we are to make the council effective. Influencing the Labor Party. In July of 1980, the Labor Party council member and unionist Alan O'Neill claimed the Socialist Action League and Socialist Unity Party were infiltrating the Labor Party. It appears to be a new tactic of these political organizations to get their members into the party, to incite from within and push their own political dogmas. Other labor figures made similar accusations, but nothing was done. By the early 1980s, the SUP had gained control of New Zealand Federation of Labour and most of the major unions in the engineering, dairy, hotel, and transport industries. These unions were affiliated with the Labour Party and enjoyed block voting rights at party conferences. Every financial member of an affiliated union was counted as a member of the Labour Party. This gave affiliated unions thousands of votes each, which, when coordinated, guaranteed the SUP's ability to choose the Labour Party's president, executive, policy council, and to influence policy on that council. Understandably, the SUP took advantage of this preferential system so that through the mid to late 1980s, the majority of the Labour Party senior officials were SUP sympathizers or secret members. The same infiltration was occurring at branch level, ensuring the SUP became the leading power bloc in the Labour Party. SUP members studying at Lenin's Institute in Moscow during the early 1980s were drilled extensively by their Russian tutors on the advantages to the Soviet Union that could accrue from the election of a Labour government in New Zealand. On June 6, 1984, SUP National Secretary George Jackson addressed the meeting of his party's Hamilton branch. He explained the rationale for supporting Labour in the upcoming national elections. According to a party document, Jason stated that the Federation of Labor and combined state unions, later joined under the Council of Trade Unions banner, have more influence on the Labor Party than for many years. And the trade union structures have the ability to transform economic campaigns to political campaigns. Infiltrating the infiltrators. It was later revealed by me and Auckland journalist Bernard Moran, that is Trevor Loudon, that the SUP was itself infiltrated by a humble truck driver who was later selected to attend a specialist course at Lenin's Institute in Moscow. John van de Ven, a Dutch immigrant, was a stocky, powerfully built, and full of restless energy. In the late 1970s, Van de Ven worked as a tanker driver for Mobil and belonged to the Wellington Drivers Union run by Ken Douglas. Van de Ven raced through his delivery rounds and received several warnings that his speed was upsetting the union's workplace rules. Undeterred, he raced on till he called into the union office and forthrightly informed them that if he didn't play by the rules, he would lose his union card and would not drive trucks in Wellington again. I was mad at being treated like this, Van de Ven told us, so I decided to get even. I had no firm plans, but I knew the union was run by the SUP, so I thought that if I could get in, then sometime down the track I'll get even. It was as simple as that. Van de Ven went to the union and apologized for his misdemeanors and offered to assist with menial tasks, even hand out copies of the SUP newspaper, the Tribune. After a year's probationary period as a model unionist, his talents were recognized. Drivers' union official and senior SUP member Richie Gillespie took him aside and said the union had big things planned for him if he could prove himself. Fortuitously, in 1977, Van de Ven discovered a legitimate grievance over tire safety issues on the tankers. When the company refused to make the changes, he led a prolonged strike that paralyzed petrol supplies for weeks around the lower half of North Island. Finally, Mobil capitulated and conceded that the drivers' union, not the company, must have the final say on safety issues. Ken Douglas, impressed with Van de Ven's leadership, personally invited him to join the SUP. In 1978, he joined the Porurua, P-O-R-I-R-U-A, branch and studied Marxist-Leninist theory under a secret member, who later became a leading member of the Labour Party National Executive. Within 2 years, he took over the Porurua branch chairmanship, and in 1981 was a SUP candidate for Porurua at the general election. Still on course to get even, Van de Ven contacted NZ's Security Intelligence Service, SIS, who asked him to stay in place. He was put on the payroll, assigned a handler, and given the code name Joe Martin. Moscow sojourn. Van de Ven's common sense and street-smart talents were recognized with selection for further training in Moscow from October 29, 1983 to February 12, 1984. He went with 3 other SUP members, and 1 month later they were joined by Bill Anderson, George Jackson, and Marilyn Tucker, all SUP Central Committee members. The Moscow course had been shortened because of the developing situation in New Zealand. Van de Ven noted that his fellow delegates' passports had to be surrendered and were not stamped, so as to leave no record of their having been in the Soviet Union. He recalled, "On arrival in Moscow, we were quarantined for medical checks over 4 days and given new identities. I became John Van, Jim Thompson became Jimmy Brown, Alan Ware, Alan Wolfe, Peter Devlin, Peter J." This took place in an old mansion near Moscow. The 10 acres of woodland was surrounded by high walls so nobody could look in or out. After that, we were transported in a minibus with black curtain windows to the Lenin Institute for Higher Learning in Prospect Leningradsky, across the road from Metro Airport and underground station. There were 3,500 communists from all over the world being trained 5.5 days a week, according to the requirements of the home country. We were assigned 3 tutors who were specialists in New Zealand. They were a first name unknown for Venediev, who lectured on the national question, racial manipulation, and trade unions. He was also a staff member of the World Marxist Review. Other tutors included Bella Vorontsova, doctorate in history, and Edward Nukovich, doctorate in economics, both of whom later visited New Zealand to liaise with SUP branches. Peace was high on the agenda, as one tutor told us. "We have many clever people in the Soviet Union, but no one has been able to come up with a weapon potentially as powerful as the peace movement." Taking New Zealand out of ANZUS. Van de Ven was told the reason for the condensed 13-week course was that Soviet leader and former KGB chief Yuri Andropov had initiated strategy for taking a social democratic country out of the Western Alliance by utilizing the correlation of forces provided by the peace and labor movement. This was the time of massive anti-nuclear marches in Europe. The Greenham Common Peace protesters in England, anti-NATO sentiment was sweeping Europe. Fueled by the peace movement, local communist parties, and professional Soviet propagandists. There was a real fear in some circles that NATO might disintegrate, and the Soviets were doing everything they could to make that fear a reality. New Zealand was given a high priority by the Soviets for strategic propaganda potential. The Soviets prioritized countries according to their strategic interest. The United Kingdom, Chile, Argentina, and South Africa were Category 1. Tiny New Zealand was in Category 2, alongside the then Soviet client state, India. The particular circumstances of New Zealand, with the national election in late 1984, were seen as providing a suitable testing ground for this strategy. If it worked as intended, then the concept could be applied to countries such as Denmark. If New Zealand could be broken away from the Western Alliance, the Soviets reasoned that other countries could be persuaded to follow suit. There were 2 key aims: to get rid of ANZUS, for the Labour government to steer nuclear-free legislation through Parliament. Van de Ven described the techniques of the strategy as brilliant, which, when applied with the trade unions, the peace movement, and the Labour Party, worked as intended. He recalled, "Our role was to influence and steer the peace movement, not by taking the top jobs, but to be done in such a way that the top people in the various peace groups were seen as reasonably responsible by the average New Zealander. So, our training consisted of being able to train lesser-known communists, secret members, sympathizers, and fellow travelers to take over these groups, unite them, but never take the leading roles. My own role was as a nuts-and-bolts technician." The overall project director was Gennady Yanev, an engineer by training and later a leading member of the 1991 coup that overthrew Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Van de Ven got on well with Yaneyev and was several times invited to his home for meals and drinks. He found Yaneyev a dedicated honest communist who frequently vented his disgust at the corruption within the nomenclatura. He was informally questioned about the other members of the New Zealand delegation, Bill Anderson and Ken Douglas. Implementation. After training in Moscow, the 4 SUP members returned to New Zealand and a series of secret meetings with the unions, peace movement, and the Labour Party began. A secret contract was even signed between the SUP and the Labour Party in the hotel workers' union rooms on Marion Street in Wellington. Terms were struck. In return for SUP Federation of Labour support in the 1984 general election, the Labour Party agreed to implement the SUP's Soviet-designated anti-nuclear policies. In return for this, the SUP agreed to hold the labor unions in line, while Labour's right-wing faction would be allowed to sack thousands of government workers as part of a much-needed program of state spending cuts. New Zealanders got economic liberalization, tax reform, and a more dynamic economy in return for the destruction of their military alliance with the United States. The SUP betrayed the New Zealand labor movement to serve the strategic interests of their Soviet masters. John Van de Ven was interviewed by Bernard Moran and Trevor Loudon in February of 1990 and again in 1991. In 1985, with the Labour government in power, the NZ-SIS cut ties with John Van de Ven. The SIS simply could not trust the new Prime Minister to keep their agent's identity secret. Hardly 1 in 1,000 New Zealanders would have any inkling that the anti-nuclear policies they are so proud of were designed in Moscow. The Soviets duped a whole country just as they have done many times before and since. Well, that's example 1. And I think we'll take a break. But that's example 1 of this tactic in the chapter Communism's Big Secret in the book The Enemies Within by Trevor Loudon of New Zealand.